Welcome everybody back here to the Lapham meeting room. If this is your first time back, I certainly welcome you. For those on Zoom, again, we're very excited to have you joining us as well. My name is Jeff Zay. I'm the Adult Programming Coordinator here at the Port Washington Library. 2 weeks ago today, we held our first in-person hybrid sandwiched in almost 2 years. It went very well. My colleague Bob Waldman gave a presentation about his dad, Myron Waldman, an animator. And we're continuing today with another hybrid program. I want to thank all of you for your patience learning the new technologies, taking the extra time to register for our events. I want to thank my fellow staff for helping make this event possible, as well as the support of the library's administration for helping guide us to this moment today. I think we're going to continue to have more hybrid programs. I think we'll be able to continue to expand as safety protocols allow to have a larger audience here in person as well. But we're going to be continuing to make these programs available on Zoom. So for those of you joining us on Zoom, we have you muted, but as always, you can type any questions you may have into the chat and we'll read those out during Q&A. We do have, or will have, the closed captions turned on. Bob, if you got it, great. You can always turn that feature off if you wish. And for those of you here in person, I just want to ask that you raise your hand if you have a question. I'll come around with the mic. That way everybody's able to hear your question. Please do make sure to silence your cell phones during the program. Thanks again for your patience as we are using some new technology today to bring you this program wherever you may be. And very excited to get started. So I want to let you know about some upcoming events and then we'll get right to Dr. Ron Brown. So this evening at 7:30, we have a Sound Swap live music event with singer-songwriter Barry Waller right here on the stage behind me. This will be a hybrid event. You can attend either in person or on Zoom, and you'll need to register for either of those options. Then on Tuesday, March 1st, believe it or not, spring is coming. We have part one of a 5-part virtual vegetable gardening series. This series is just on Zoom and has been organized by Cornell Cooperative Extension of Nassau County and co-sponsored by Plant a Row for the Hungry Port Washington. Each session will be led by a master gardener volunteer, and the series will provide information and resources on how to start and grow your own vegetable garden. For those who attended this series last year, which was very popular, there will be some updated content and topics that will be covered this year. Then next Friday, believe it or not, we are welcoming Ron Brown back again. The scheduling just happened to work out that way. So we have another hybrid sandwiched in, and he's going to begin a new series in March about different New York City neighborhoods. And on March 4th, he's going to take a look at Central Park in spring, something very nice to think about on a icy day like today. So I do want to thank our friends of the library for their generous support of today's program. And here's a little background about our presenter today. After decades spent traveling the world and picking up university degrees from Jerusalem, Harvard, and Geneva, Dr. Ron Brown settled in New York City in 1992. He has been teaching history, ethnic studies, and political science at Touro College and world religions at the Unification Theological Seminary for over 25 years. He has been deeply involved in the cultural life of New York City through his work as a featured speaker at the New York Historical Society, New York Council for the Humanities, and numerous other libraries, historical societies, colleges, and universities. And we welcome Dr. Ron Brown back today to take us around the world to the city of New Orleans. So take it away.
Well, thank you, Jeff. You know, the first thing when I walked into this room, because we haven't been back here in quite a while, about 2 years, and when I walked in, I was astounded at all of the electronics. Now, I'm allowed to take off my mask as the speaker, okay? But I think the requirement for the hall is that the audience is requested to be masked, okay? So I was astounded to see all of this electronics. I mean, that I have a whole table over here and all kinds of other things. I mean, this is a big expense for a library. And so it's really great that now we can have me in person, and at the same time we can have all the people on Zoom for the various talks. So But it's really great to be back here. I mean, I've been lecturing here for I don't know how many years, and I'm sure a lot of you, do you remember Jessica, who used to be in charge? Yes, she's still going well. We email back and forth periodically, and so now that's been a lot of history. So now, our topic for today is New Orleans. How many of you have been to New Orleans? Probably the best part of you. Okay. Now, I have traveled around the world. I lived 5 years in Jerusalem, a year in Moscow, a year in Budapest, a year in Prague, 7 years in Geneva, Switzerland, 5 years in Boston. I just got back from another month in Mexico. I've been all over the place, although this year I decided to avoid the Ukraine as a tourist spot, but I've always loved New Orleans. It is really one of those very, very special cities. So let's get started. Let me see. There we go. Okay. Now, New Orleans is one of the most mysterious cities in the world. In fact, there's an entire library of books about New Orleans. For example, Haunted New Orleans. It seems it's never plain old ordinary New Orleans. It's either haunted, or it's New Orleans noir, or it's a spirit world. It's filled with voodoos and vampires. Anne Rice, who I'm sure a lot of you have read her wonderful books, just recently passed away. A great loss for a person who has really preserved a lot of what makes New Orleans special. Well, New Orleans, like every city in the world, has its own character. New York City, of course, is the Empire City. Paris, the city of love. Moscow, very much in the news these days, is the third Rome, the heir to the Roman Empire in Italy, the heir to the Byzantine Empire of Constantinople. So if you want to understand Vladimir Putin and what he is up to, just look at the idea of Moscow as the third Rome. Rome, of course, is the eternal city. Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love. Shanghai, the pearl of the Orient. Cairo, the city of 1,000 minarets. Jerusalem, the city of war and peace. Every city has its own personality. Now, this personality is largely determined by geography. Why did New York develop the idea of New York as the Empire City? Who named it the Empire City? None other than George Washington, who was convinced that New York City was going to remain the largest city in the American Empire, which one day would stretch from the Atlantic to the Pacific, the best natural harbor in North America. It was destined by geography to be the Empire City. St. Petersburg, the window to the West, this little window of great Russia expanding across Siberia as a little window to Western Europe. Brasilia, the interior city, leaving Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo with their colonial associations, building a brand new city in the middle of the jungle. Washington, D.C., the geography, equidistant between the northern colonies and the slave southern colonies. City I haven't visited yet, the new capital of Abuja in Nigeria, equidistant between the Muslim north and the Christian south, trying to keep the two halves of the country together. Beijing, the middle of the Middle Kingdom. Alexandria, Egypt, founded by Alexander the Great. This was Egypt's window to the Mediterranean. Well, you can't underestimate geography when it comes to New Orleans. Look at the map on the left. You see this delicate delta inching out into the Gulf of Mexico. It is mud. It is swamp. Half the time of the day it's underwater with high tide, and then it peaks above the water when it is low tide, constantly being swamped by hurricanes from the south and floods from the north. Makes you think of Genesis. And God said, let the waters under the heaven be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear. And so it was. And God called the dry land earth, and he called the wetlands the seas. And God saw that it was good. Well, evidently, when Genesis was written, nobody had visited New Orleans, because there, as you can see from the map, the water and the land have never been separate. It is a land of swamps, of Spanish moss, where the land barely survives and becomes dry, and then it is swamped. Even the waters are covered with vegetation. It is a land where there is no separation between earth and water. In fact, even the ancient Biloxi Indians who lived in what is today New Orleans and Louisiana recognized that this was a unique place on the face of the earth where dead and living continued, where water and land mixed. Their famous Biloxi legend of the Biloxi mermaid. They believed that in the waters off of the coast of New Orleans was an entire city under the water, ruled by the Biloxi mermaid. And that on the night of a full moon, she would come onto the land, she would sing her song, and she would welcome those who had died into her underwater kingdom. And even when the French arrived, and of course French missionaries and city buildings, there was the poem where the Biloxi mermaid came out of the waters and told the Biloxi Indians, don't worry about these Spanish, because neither bells of the church, books, the Bible, nor the Christian cross will win me from your queen. The music that haunts the bay when she comes out in the full moon, rising through the water when the moon is out, will confirm that I am still in my kingdom deep under the waters. We ask everybody to turn off their cell phones, and I forgot to turn off mine. So, sorry about that. So the area of New Orleans is an area where water and land are constantly at battle. Whether it's a flood coming down the Mississippi, wiping out everything in its path, hurricanes coming in from the Gulf of Mexico, wiping out everything. It is a land where life and death, water and land, do not have a clear boundary. And if the hurricanes and floods won't kill you, it is a swamp. And so you have leopards, you have mosquitoes, and I think the mosquitoes of New Orleans are the largest in the world. Some of them are the size of a small automobile, I'm convinced. You have scorpions, you have spiders, you have rattlesnakes, you have crocodiles, which will finish you off very quickly. So it is a swampy area where people realize that life is precarious and death is just around the corner. Epidemics have constantly decimated the population of New Orleans. We see Le Petit Journal under the French. The front cover is Le Choléra, a great cholera epidemic sweeping across the city. The yellow fever epidemic of summer of 1853 killed off 8,000 people just in New Orleans itself. Hurricanes. By 1718, New Orleans was declared the capital of Louisiana, where the ships would come up from France. The ocean-going ships could reach New Orleans, and in New Orleans, they would put them on riverboats going up and down the river. Well, no sooner was the city built, and you see the plan of the original French city, built on a high rise above the actual river. But north of the river, where you see the writing, Plan et Projet Nouvelle-Orléans, there the land was already under the sea level. Well, the French built it as their port on the Caribbean. Well, of course, the Caribbean was contested by the Spanish in Texas. It was contested by the English in Georgia and the Carolinas. So it was fortified, and it had a stone wall around it with cannons. It was laid out in a grid plan, which you see clearly on the map. At the bottom is the square, the Place des Armes, with the eventual cathedral. Well, it looks great on paper, but September 22 to 24, just a couple years after it was built, the great hurricane erased it from the map. And since then, hurricanes have been synonymous with New Orleans. Katrina and Rita, Isaac. In fact, a hurricane decimates the city every 2.24 years. So check when the last one was and plan your next vacation accordingly. Between 1559 and 1969, 160 major hurricanes coming in off of the Caribbean have decimated the city. As if that's not bad enough, to the north is the great Mississippi River. Look at that map. Everything in the middle of the United States, from the Appalachian Mountains on the right to the Rockies on the left, up into Canada, the Mississippi, the Missouri, the Ohio, the Arkansas, Red, Tennessee rivers, all merge in the mighty Mississippi. 1719, the city was swept away by a giant flood. 1731. 1816, the city was underwater for 1 month. Talk about moldy clothes. Well, the next big one was 3 months, 1882. And of course, the Great Flood of 1929, which ravaged the entire city. 1973, $500 million of real estate was lost. So New Orleans is clearly a place where God never intended people to live. Well, if hurricanes and floods are not enough, New Orleans is built on an earthquake fault. 1811, December 16, see on the map, the great red area. The earth shook, the earth heaved. New Orleans was forced up into the air, and it remained in the air from December to February. North of New Orleans became a giant lake because the Mississippi River had no place to go. And then in February 7th, New Orleans plummeted back into the ground, and all of the water that had built up flowed down and once again demolished the city. For several months, the Mississippi even flowed north because it could not cut through New Orleans. In fact, those people who survived were so convinced that this flood was a warning from God against the evil ways of the French in New Orleans that they converted, they baptized themselves into the flood, and they became known as the earthquake Christians. And when you travel in the Mississippi Valley, every town still has what they call their earthquake church. Here we see why New Orleans is so precarious. Look on the left, you see the Mississippi River. Only a very tiny area of land separates the Mississippi from the bowl that is New Orleans. You see St. Louis Cathedral on the map, under the water of the Mississippi. On the right, you see another high rise, and that's what keeps Lake Pontchartrain out of the city. But in between is a giant bowl. When the Mississippi floods, it fills in the bowl. When Lake Pontchartrain floods, it fills in the bowl. So it was a place where people should have never built a city. Hurricane Katrina, August 29, 2005. 80% of the city was underwater. 1,200 deaths, 100 billion in damages. Now, this is not just the city itself, but it is also the harbor, where all of the agricultural produce, industrial produce of the entire Mississippi Valley flows south to New Orleans. Ships coming from Europe and around the world and China land in New Orleans. Everything is transferred to riverboats going up the river. So the area has constantly been a disaster waiting to happen. But yet the city continued to grow, and it continues to grow, although in recent years it has been losing population. Following the 1929 flood, the Great Flood, the federal government decided to build levees on both sides of the river, the Mississippi, to keep the water in the Mississippi. Well, it sounds like a good idea, but there is too much water coming down. And when the water does break through one of the levees, it goes in and it will flood the city. So the levees gives a certain amount of protection, but not enough to protect the city. So why the hell did the French build New Orleans in 1717? Well, they realized that the Mississippi Valley is one of the most fertile places on the face of the earth. Constant floods are covering the area with delta. The area from the Appalachians to the Rockies produces enough food to feed the world. Well, back in 1717, it wasn't really the food that was important. It also produced cotton. And so the French built New Orleans. They built plantations going up the Mississippi. The cotton, huge bales were brought down to Mississippi on riverboats and then switched over to ocean-going vessels. In addition to cotton, tobacco, rice, indigo. Anybody know what indigo is? Blue jeans. Yes, that is the dye of blue jeans. Every other color is stable. Blue, science has never been able to make a blue color that is stable. Even indigo comes close, but not enough. Now, every guy who has gone to college and didn't have mother around to do laundry realizes that you never put blue jeans in with your white underwear and t-shirts, because everything comes out a pale blue, okay? So indigo was one of the major products of the French. Huge plantations were built. Tens of thousands of slaves were brought from Africa. So New Orleans was a money city. The famous architecture, whether it is the mansions of the Garden District or whether it is the apartment buildings of the French Quarter, which you see on the top on the left, the Paris Opera House, built in the French Quarter, called the French Opera House. New Orleans was money. Even the wealthy people who lived in plantation houses had their mansions in the Garden District and in the French Quarter, and they would spend the spring and the fall season in New Orleans. And so it was a concentration of high culture. Now, the French who came over, many of them were the third son of a duke or a baron. Son number one inherited the fortune. Son number two was sent to university and became a general or some other professional person. But son number three really had no future in France, and so he would come out of France, come to New Orleans, and was intent on working hard and becoming as rich as his father back in France. So many of the French were of aristocratic families, unlike the United States, which sort of inherited, weird people, rejects of Europe, like Quakers and Baptists and, Puritans and French Huguenot refugees. The French brought over the cream of the crop. And so they had opera houses, libraries, magnificent mansions. St. Louis Cathedral, named after Saint Louis, St. Louis, first one was built in 1720, typical Catholic style. You have the big central square, the Place des Armes, and you have the cathedral dominating it with government buildings on each side. In Mexico, it's called the Zócalo. Magnificent cathedral, giant square, official buildings on either side. The French and the Spanish planned their city. There was no haphazard building. 1794, the second St. Louis Cathedral was built, and that is the current cathedral. The population continued to attract French-speaking people, famous Cajuns, who were expelled from what is today New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, Prince Edward Island. When the French took over the mouth of the St. Lawrence River, they rounded up the Cajuns, which comes from Acadia, and many of them were exiled to New Orleans, where they continue until today to speak their Cajun dialect. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow wrote his book Evangeline, A Tale of Acadie in 1847. Now, if you look at the map on the right, you see New France, which is the St. Lawrence River, the Great Lakes area, and the Mississippi. On the map by 1667, the Spanish had taken over New Orleans, but it remained a French-speaking city. Now, the Cajuns have been celebrated as part of the New Orleans and the Delta culture. James Lee Burke, I'm sure we have at least 100 of his books here in the library, is one of the greatest writers about the Cajuns. He talks about his book, The Crusaders' Cross, Feast Day of the Fools, Dixie City Jam, Purple Cane Road, is all about the life of the Cajuns, living in the swamps, speaking their dialect, fiercely Catholic, but totally superstitious. Creole is a word which we use for the Cajuns, Creoles. Well, today when we say Creole, we mean originally a mixture of black and white. But in French and Spanish, the word Creole means pure French blood, but born in the colonies. So the French of New Orleans, just like the Spanish of Mexico, were very proud to say, I'm a Creole, meaning I am of pure white Spanish and French blood, but just was born in the colonies. So in New Orleans, when someone says they are a Creole, that means pure French blood. Whereas in modern English, such as the book on the right, you see that the children are of mixed blood. But a real New Orleans French would never admit that a mixed blood person could be a Creole. Well, the French were into making money. So they realized early on that they needed farmers to produce wheat, meat, and other products to supply New Orleans with foodstuffs. So they brought over thousands of Germans. These were mainly Alsatians, Alsace-Lorraine, German-speaking people, who they brought over, and they settled along the Mississippi going north from New Orleans up to Baton Rouge or whatever. On the map at the bottom, you see the meandering Mississippi. So each German family that would come over would be given a mile branch on the Mississippi, going inland as far as they could possibly cultivate. Now, these Germans were fierce German, and they were fierce Lutheran. And they became some of the most, I should put that out in the hall, maybe it's bothering people. Yeah, it's in my coat pocket. It's in the coat, so take the coat out. Thanks. So these Germans settled there. Well, like all of the slave owners in America as well as New Orleans, your slaves adopted the language of the master. So you had Jewish plantation owners in New Orleans whose slaves became Jewish. You had Lutheran Germans whose slaves became Lutheran. Others, most of them became Catholic. So that's a wonderful area north of New Orleans, which most tourists never visit. But you see these old Lutheran churches where you go into them today and the entire congregation is Black. Very powerful Black Lutheran community north of New Orleans. New Orleans was a slave city. Louisiana and the Mississippi Valley was marked by slavery, where the white owners lived in the mansions, the big plantation homes, and the slaves worked in the fields. New Orleans was famous for its Code Noir, which regulated every aspect of white and Black relations. It ranked the people because the French had no problems messing around with their girl slaves, and so they produced all kinds of mixed blood people. And according to the Code Noir, there was a name for every mixture. If you were half French, 1/4 African slave, and 1/4 Native American Indian, you had a special name, and that's how you identified yourself. One interesting thing about the Code Noir is that the slaves had Sunday off, since the majority had become Catholic, and they were allowed to gather after church on Sunday and make their music, have their entertainment, and that was the origin of what we call today modern jazz. Now, New Orleans, especially for those who managed to survive the hurricanes, the pestilence, the disease, the floods, and the ravages of nature, considered themselves a chosen people. They lamented the deaths of those who passed because of some type of terrible tragedy. But those who lived would stand up and celebrate and said, I have survived. Whether it was the Great Flood of 1719, the hurricanes every 2.24 years, every summer, the cholera, the yellow fever, whatever ravaged the city, the survivors developed their own unique culture. It's only inevitable that Mardi Gras, Fat Tuesday, the day before Ash Wednesday, should become the most celebrated day in New Orleans. In fact, the very first recorded Mardi Gras was 1699, even before New Orleans existed. Well, why was Mardi Gras so important? Well, anybody who has been Catholic knows that on Ash Wednesday, all the Catholics show up with the smudge of ashes on their forehead. Because on Ash Wednesday, the beginning of Lent, which culminates in Jesus' crucifixion and eventual resurrection, Ash Wednesday was a day when you went into mourning. You went to the church, the priest put ashes and recited, from dust thou art, and until dust thou shalt return. In my family, which was super Catholic, throughout Lent, no television, no radio, no music, no dessert, no candy, no laughing, no games. It was a serious time to ponder that you are dust and that you will die. So what do good Catholics do the day before Ash Wednesday in this terrible period of Lent? Well, all hell breaks loose. And so that was the time of celebration. Well, when death was such an ever-present reality in New Orleans, you can be sure that they celebrated, number one, I'm still here for another Mardi Gras, and I am going to let the world know. And so Mardi Gras is a celebration of every aspect of life: sex, alcohol, food, dancing, music, costumes, you name it. You are celebrating the fact that you have survived to another Mardi Gras. Celebrate life. Well, New Orleans, his Mardi Gras business sort of got out of hand. And even the Pope in Rome said, well, we are more pagan than we are Catholic. This is taking it a bit to an extreme. So the Pope ordered a Spanish priest, Franciscans, who had headed the Inquisition in Spain, Friar Antonio de Sevilla, ordered him to go to New Orleans to stamp out this heresy and this overexuberance of Mardi Gras. So Père Antoine, as he was known in Paris or in New Orleans, arrived in New Orleans in 1774. Well, he arrived in the middle of an epidemic which was killing thousands of people. I think about 3 days after he arrived, a hurricane arrived to say hello. And then the next week there was a flood, and then there was another infestation of malaria. And he realized, in fact, that what the New Orleanians were doing was celebrating life. And he said, I survived all of these plagues in my first several months here. And he became the biggest supporter of New Orleans in its history. And in fact, he is the most beloved saint in New Orleans, even though the Catholic Church still shuns him as a heretic. But still, it was New Orleans that overcame the Inquisition or the Inquisitor. Africans merged their African traditions with Christianity of the French. In fact, part of the Code Noir said that on Sunday, the African slaves were allowed to gather in Congo Square, which is a big open square, a park, which still exists in New Orleans. And there they were allowed to beat their drums and dance their African music, sell and make their magical amulets. And from this Sunday gathering of African culture, blending with an old broken down piano, a guitar, a banjo, a trumpet, a saxophone, what emerged was a whole new religion experience, which was voodoo, the merging of African religion with Catholicism. Papa Legba, who was one of the great African deities, which the slaves brought over with them, they said, oh, well, that's the same thing as Jesus Christ. So they would go to the church on Sunday morning. They go up to the statue of Jesus. They would say their prayer, but they knew they were really praying to Papa Legba. And so this blending of Catholicism and African religion produced its own form of New Orleans religion, which we call today voodoo. And this was also the place in Congo Square that African rhythms, African style of music, the dialogue form of African American music blended with French music and created a whole new form of music, which today we call jazz. Louis Armstrong, New Orleans child, died in Queens, 1971, one of the great migrants from New Orleans who brought this new form of music to New York. Marie Laveau, the great priestess of voodoo, 1794, 1881. Once again, merged Catholicism with African religion. They say she could cast spells. She could expel demons. Some people said she could even raise the dead. On the right, you see her tomb. Now, if you look closely at the tomb, you see all tombs in New Orleans are built above ground. Because when the city floods, if a casket is underground, it will rise to the surface and go floating away. So, and you can see from the weathered tombs, you build it of brick, you put it above ground. Well, every storm, every flood damages it. But if you look at the base of the tomb, you can see that people are still coming there, putting flowers, invoking her intercession, either to get a husband, or to get rid of the husband you don't want anymore, or to get pregnant, or to please, Lord, no more babies. I mean, this was the power of Marie Laveau, once again condemned by the official Catholics, but yet a typical New Orleans form of religion. Cemetery visits. Well, when you have a funeral in New Orleans, you don't go into mourning or sadness, because in New Orleans, remember the Biloxi Indians, you never really die. If you live in New Orleans, you go and you join the Biloxi mermaid in her castle under the sea. So New Orleans, a strong sense that life goes on even after death. So with a funeral procession, it's no People aren't dressed in black and weeping and wailing and rending their clothes and covering themselves with ashes. It is music, trumpets, all kinds of things. And this is the famous St. Louis Cemetery #1. Well, the French developed all kinds of new religious expressions. For example, there was a very famous statue of Notre Dame de Bon Secours, Our Lady of Prompt Rescue, which was brought from France in 1810 to New Orleans. Well, it arrived just in time for the War of 1812, when we all know that the French attacked New Orleans. But what did the people of New Orleans do? They took their new statue, and according to the legend, they marched up to the English, and the English fled when they saw the power of the statue. It also stemmed the Great Fire of 1812, which almost decimated the city. And so Notre Dame de Bon Secours has become one of the patrons of New Orleans. And on the right, you see her church, which is right near Congo Square. Mother Margaret, the mother of orphans, the angel of the Delta, an Irish refugee fleeing Ireland during the Great Potato Famine, arrived with her husband and an estimated 13 children, arrived in 1835 in New Orleans, and within 1 year, all of her children were dead from disease or snake bites. Her husband was dead. She devoted the rest of her life to taking care of orphans. And on the left, you see her statue, which is still there today, and the Mother Margaret Orphanage, which still functions. Fascinating chapter of New Orleans when you have so many people dying in so many different waves. You have a huge number of orphans, more than any other city. In fact, you had the St. Elizabeth Orphanage, Catholic, Louis Home for Girls, St. Vincent Infant Asylum, St. Teresa of Avila Orphanage, the Jews Asylum, the German Protestant Asylum, the German Catholic Orphanage, the Episcopal Home. This was every religious group that found its way to New Orleans ended up building an orphanage. You've heard of Lehman College, the great Lehman family. Governor Lehman, one of the founders of, what was I going to say? Temple Emmanuel on Fifth Avenue. He made his fortune in the slave trade in Alabama and New Orleans, one of the most successful slave traders before the Civil War. And he sponsored one of the Jewish orphan asylums in New Orleans before the family migrated to New York. In fact, the Jews of New Orleans were a rather unique group. Of course, they were looked down upon by every other kind of Jew. They were called the swamp Jews, because the Jews of New Orleans, like the Lehman brothers and Lehman father, they took up with Catholic girls, because there were no Jewish girls. They took up with their African slaves and produced a whole collection of mixed blood children. So they established the very first synagogue in New Orleans in 1828, the Gates of Mercy. See a drawing of it. And it was typical New Orleans swamp Judaism. Intermarriage was fine. It was all right to have a man who practiced Judaism, because most of the Jews of New Orleans were men, and he had his Catholic wife, so they would have Christmas and go to church Sunday morning, and then Friday night they would go to the synagogue. They all had Catholic wives. Children were both religions. They practiced a liberal form of kosher. Open Passover, which was unique at the time, where everybody joined for Passover. It was all right to work on the Sabbath. Slave children eventually became the majority in the synagogue. And of course, a well-to-do plantation owner may have had his Catholic wife, but he had 5 or 6 slave girls who he was having children with. And so this was the famous swamp synagogue. Once again, adapting to the unique situation of the Delta. Blessed Francis Xavier Seelos, one of the great German immigrants, built the church you see on the right, arrived and became the yellow fever priest, refusing to flee the city like the wealthy people did when the yellow fever swept the city. And the great yellow fever epidemic, in which 3,100 people died, including Father Seelos himself. In fact, he is fondly remembered in statues and in the Catholic Church where he is buried. The Italians had an interesting history there. They started arriving after New Orleans passed to the English. And they loved their holidays. But of course, they had to adapt Italian Catholicism to New Orleans. So the story is one of the early Catholic priests decided he wanted to build a church, and he wanted a statue, a real statue from Italy. Well, one day a ship arrived, and there was a box on it, big wooden box, but all of the paperwork had been washed off during a storm. So they opened the box, and inside was a statue of a man. The only piece of paper that remained on the outside of the box was the word in English, expedite, meaning send quickly. Well, of course, the Italians fell down on their knees, and until today, the church and the holiday of Santo Expedite is a legend of New Orleans, the patron saint of the Catholic Italians of New Orleans. Well, not only did New Orleans develop its own culture, its own holidays and everything else, it did develop its own unique cuisine. The beignet, deep fried with powdered sugar on top. If you have cholesterol problems or you're prone to diabetes, avoid them. But it is really one of those things where you do have to splurge. The Cafe Du Monde, this very special chicory and coffee, which is unique to New Orleans. The Cafe Du Monde, once again, one of these lovely outdoor terraces. Antoine's Restaurant since 1840. Once again, a little bit of Paris. Once again, remember, there were dukes and marquises and aristocrats who settled in New Orleans and really gave it a high-class culture that Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and all these other refugee cities of the English could not rival. And so, famous restaurants and high-class culture. This is the Court of the Two Sisters. Building dates from 1832. Two sisters, Bertha and Emma, both who died in 1944, were Creole aristocrats, in a sense of New Orleans Creole, pure French blood, but born in New Orleans. This claims to have the best French Creole cuisine. The shrimp étouffée, ville grillade, with corn grits and bread, pudding with whiskey sauce. Entrees on a four-course dinner menu include veal au scar, duck à l'orange, and shrimp and grits. Once again, a unique cuisine, very much of New Orleans. The French, of course, have long forgotten the French language. The Creoles, the Cajuns still speak dialect, but it is not a pure form of French. But still, many of the restaurants will have a French restaurant. Now, if you look closely, you'll see le restaurant stupéfié, meaning the stupefying, fantastic restaurant. But look at it carefully. What's the very first thing? Entrée. In English, that vulgar language, an entrée is the main course we have. But in French, entrée means simply the first course, as in you enter into the meal. Then you have salad and you have dessert. Chicory coffee, famous Cafe Du Monde, which you can buy everywhere and anywhere, especially in the French market. Actually, I don't like chicory very much. It doesn't have a good taste to me. But here again, I would never say that in New Orleans. But that is a sort of a unique plant, the chicory plant, which they mix with the coffee, and it gives it a rather unique taste. Of course, gumbo. I mean, once again, gumbo is sort of almost anything can be in it, but it is primarily of a strongly favored stock, meat or shellfish, or a thicker of what Louisianans called the holy trinity of vegetables: celery, bell peppers, onions. Gumbo is often categorized by the type of thickener used, whether okra or file powder, dried or ground sassafras leaves. And every restaurant has its own style. I mean, I go to these little stands that sell gumbo. Every one is different. Every one tastes different. And every place claims that they have the best gumbo in New Orleans. Jambalaya, meat and vegetables mixed with rice. This is a traditional rice dish. Sausage of some sort. You like sausage, you never ask what's in it. A smoked meat such as andouille, along with pork or chicken or seafood. Almost anything can go into it. The vegetables are usually the holy trinity of onion, celery, green pepper, bell peppers. Although other vegetables, okra, carrots, can also be used. So this is a rice dish. And in fact, New Orleans was one of the biggest producers of rice along the Mississippi River in North America. Now, Anne Rice, I think, has really preserved the culture of New Orleans, like James Lee Burke preserved the culture of the Cajuns. And here again, she is very New Orleans. She went through her Catholic phases, and then she would go off into vampires and who knew what else. In her later years, she moved from her house in New Orleans and moved to San Francisco, but ended up moving back to New Orleans, where she died just a few years ago. Her famous book, Interview with the Vampire, very much New Orleans. And when you watch the movie with Tom Cruise, or you read this book or many of her other books on vampires, you see that it is New Orleans. You never die. Life and death are so interconnected that it is not at all strange to have voodoo dolls, to have the living dead, to have vampires who are both living and dead at the same time. So she really captures this unique world where life and death are not separate. You can die and join the Biloxi princess in her kingdom under the sea and come back to New Orleans periodically. This is her house in the garden. It was her house in the Garden District. I went on a tour there once. The famous vampire Lestat. I'm sure her books are all up here, as well as the movies. If you want a great experience of New Orleans, because with like the vampire Lestat, it is very New Orleans. It is decaying mansions. It is storm, but with a strong connection with France. Zombies are in every street corner in New Orleans. These are the living dead. Books like The Night of the Living Dead, Zombieland, really thrive in New Orleans. But interestingly, the idea of a zombie, a person who is neither dead nor alive, goes back actually to the Epic of Gilgamesh, the 18th century BCE, which is the first zombie story. Other movies, once again, really capturing the essence of New Orleans, A Streetcar Named Desire. Sure, it's in the library. Vivian Leigh, Marlon Brando. I mean, when you watch the movie, you just sweat from the heat. I mean, it could be today and it could be freezing outside, but you feel the heat and the oppressive humidity. Panic in the Streets, again, one of the film noir series, which again capture the spirit of New Orleans. The music of Louis Moreau Gottschalk, one of the Jewish immigrants who went to New Orleans, born 1829 in New Orleans, studied in France, traveled all over the world as a pianist, died in 1869 in Rio de Janeiro, right after having given a concert of his music. Music such as A Night in the Tropics, La Nuit Tropicale. Once again, blended jazz, blended the popular culture of New Orleans with the best of European classical music. Cakewalk, the music of Louis Moreau Gottschalk. Once again, not well known, but probably considered the most famous of New Orleans classical composers. Well, if you're looking for something to do, Sunday, late June, the New Orleans Zombie Run. It's sort of like the New York Marathon, but you have to dress as a zombie. Fake blood, you know, white powder, and you pick up your packet, and there's no age limit. If you're old enough to run, then you're old enough to run from zombies. It's sort of one of these crazy New Orleans things, similar to the Mermaid Parade out at Coney Island, something to keep the culture of zombies alive. The Confederate Memorial Hall, the Louisiana Civil War Museum, commemorates the War of Northern Aggression. But you have to be very careful. I went to this museum, and at the time I was a docent at the New York Historical Society. And between museums and historical societies, there's a certain reciprocity. And I show my ID and I get in for free, and they come to New York to get into Historical Society for free. Well, I took out my New York Historical Society card, and I went up to the desk of the Louisiana Civil War Museum, and I said, do you accept reciprocal memberships? And the woman said, oh, of course, yes, yes, show me your card. And she said, oh, New York. We don't honor cards north of the Mason-Dixon line. I thought she was joking. Well, she wasn't. And I said, well, when I go back to New York, I will inform you that you don't accept their card. She gave me a dirty look and she said, and you just do that. So, I mean, the war of Northern aggression is still alive and well in New Orleans. But it also has a wonderful National World War II museum, which is very worth visiting. There is the Voodoo Museum, where you can see and buy all kinds of things, sort of like a Mexican botanica. You can buy your gris-gris. In fact, I know the gris are authentic because when I was in northern Cameroon years ago, the witch doctor came out and saw that I was already in my 30s and I was not a father of 13 children yet. So he put a gris-gris around my neck, which was a leather thong, with a little packet at the end sewn into leather with herbs and amulets and stuff, which would make me attract a wife within days and produce children immediately. You know, well, needless to say that gris-gris is now in a box in my apartment somewhere. So that is New Orleans. Once again, this is what I looked like many years ago. That's me when I was in my 20s and living in Jerusalem. Look at all that hair I had. You know, I still have the hair, but it's changing colors. So, once again, so much for our visit to New Orleans. Now, okay, do we have any questions or comments?
Well, thank you, Ron. We'll get to some questions in just a second. But again, I want to thank you very much. Another terrific talk today. You certainly reminded me how much New Orleans is. It's almost an international city that is located here within the United States. It feels like it has so many different cultures blended together there that are still vibrant there. Quick question. So what is the proper pronunciation of the city? I've heard New Orleans, New Orleans. Is there a proper pronunciation?
Nouvelle-Orléans is probably what you would say in French. I grew up saying New Orleans. Now that it might be Pennsylvania pronunciation because my mother said Arkansas when my brother moved there. So there was a sort of my own pronunciation, the family pronunciation. But people have mentioned that when I say New Orleans, that's not the proper way, but it is the way that I grew up. So proper way would be the way you said it first. What did you say?
New Orleans?
New Orleans,
Yeah.
New Orleans without the long E. I think that would be probably more acceptable than my pronunciation.
Got it. So I'm going to check for any questions here in the chat. And then for anybody here in the audience, if you have any questions, just raise your hand and I'll be happy to come around and hand you the mic. Just a couple of comments here. Having been raised in New Orleans, I found Mr. Brown's lecture to be most interesting. Another comment, thank you so much. That was wonderful. So much history, just what I love. And here's somebody responding to our pronunciation. And yes, locals pronounce New Orleans many ways, definitely like how Mr. Brown says it.
Well, one thing about New Orleans is do not call them Southerners. They are not part of the Deep South. You never hear a Southern accent. So that if you come from, let's say, Georgia, or what we as Anglos would call the Deep South, they speak a Southern accent. But in New Orleans, anybody who speaks with a Southern accent is considered a country bumpkin, as opposed to both the French and the English who settled there really viewed themselves as aristocrats. There's a funny story. There is a very good and a very powerful English. You know, there's Canal Street, which you probably all know, which separates, on one side is the French city, and the other side is the English city, where the Garden District is. Sort of like Wall Street in New York. The Dutch were below that, and when the English took over in 1660, 68, 1665, I forget. Well, at any rate, they said, all right, everybody below canals, below Wall Street can keep everything they own, and the English will settle above. And so the English built Trinity Church on Broadway to say this is now our half of the city. Well, the English in New Orleans did the same thing. Everything on one side of Canal Street was French, everything on the other side was English. Well, the English built their big Episcopal cathedral there. Well, during the Civil War, New Orleans was one of the first cities to be captured by the North, basically to cut the South. So you had Texas on one side and then the rest of the South on the other side, and to capture New Orleans to stop the export of cotton. Well, the English were very loyal to the South. There's a funny story that one of the generals who was put in charge of New Orleans by Abraham Lincoln died while he was there of a disease or something. And so they went to the Episcopal bishop in the English half and said, would you perform the funeral? And the English bishop very reverently said, hell no. And so they arrested him. They took him before the judge, and they said, you refuse to perform the funeral for this general. And the bishop said, oh, absolutely not. He said, I would never refuse to perform the funeral for a Northern general. In fact, I would love to perform a funeral for every Northern general. So the English definitely had their influence. I forget, what was the question? Was there a question or a comment?
Let's see. I think we have a couple more comments here. So,
okay, good.
This is from AJ. Was the museum that didn't accept cards north of the Mason-Dixon line willing to accept dollars from the north?
Oh, yes,
Just
they
wondering.
were. Yes, they were very readily. In fact, that's why I had to pay the full price. Yes, yes. Now, and that brings up point two of tourism in New Orleans is a big industry, and it has suffered severely because of COVID. And in fact, they were almost desperate to keep the Mardi Gras going. And the Mardi Gras for the past 2 years has been one of the super spreaders on a par with spring break in Miami and other things. So tourism is a major industry supporting large numbers. Now, New Orleans is also a dangerous city. It has one of the highest crime rates of any city. Now, when I go there, I stay in a hotel on Canal Street, which is relatively safe. But one of the more sleazy bars that I hang out is off to one of the sides. And there you only leave the bar in a company of 4 or 5 other people, because the gangs will wait for some guy who's obviously had a little bit too much to drink to come out of the bar to walk down to one of the major streets, and you end up staggering back to the hotel without your shoes and anything else of value. It has a very, very high crime rate. Yes, be aware of that. Yes.
Yeah. Oh, you have a question?
Yes. Hurricanes as a drink, is that a New Orleans invention, or did they take it from somewhere else?
No, that is a tradition to celebrate hurricanes in bars. And they are called hurricane parties, and they have special drinks, and you don't barricade yourself away during a hurricane. You turn it into a party. And so that is a typical New Orleans thing, the hurricane party. In fact, I went there this is a number of years ago, when a hurricane was on its way. I caught the last flight into New Orleans, and the highway from the airport into the city, they call it the airport highway, was already under a foot of water when I finally got to my hotel, and I left my bag in the hotel and went out to a hurricane party. And I mean, you would see chairs being blown down the streets and, windows being smashed. And it was really a wonderful experience. And once, at that same time, I smoked cigars back then. And in the hotel, the water was 3 feet high in Canal Street, but all the windows and doors closed, and they had a trap door above it so that you could crawl out. So I went up to the woman who was working at the desk, and I said, you know, ma'am, I said, I ran out of cigars. You wouldn't by any chance have any here? And she said, oh, no, but she said, there's a cigar store just across the street. I looked out, and I got 3 feet of water out there. And she opened a trap door, and I jumped out. I could walk because 3 feet was about up to here. And I made it across the street. They opened a trap door. They gave me my cigars, and I paid for it. And I went back. And then every morning, a boat would come, and it would deliver bagels and croissants and stuff for breakfast, which would go in the trap door. So, I mean, hurricanes there are part of the experience. One thing, if you really want a wonderful hurricane experience, is, you know, that you see these streets that go down, and then you can see across the river and stuff. When a hurricane is coming, suddenly you'll see a big building here and a big building here in the street. Suddenly, from out of the building will come rolling a giant steel door that they meet in the middle, clamp together, and fall into place. And they're usually about 6 feet tall to block the street from the ravages of the river. And when they roll out, I mean, it is an absolutely earth-shattering experience to feel them rolling and then falling into place, to see how they have managed to protect large parts of the city. So if you get a chance, I mean, and you see a hurricane coming, catch the last flight, and it'll be the experience of your life. It might be the last experience of your life, but I survived several hurricanes in New Orleans. Absolutely thrilling. Yes.
Well, I don't think the library will recommend that anybody fly to a hurricane zone, but we have another comment and question here regarding the accent. The accent is more like a Brooklyn accent, like Harry Connick Jr. and Walter Isaacson. This is from Nancy. A Southern accent is usually someone not born in New Orleans.
Precisely. And many people have made the comment that the New Orleans accent resembles very much the Brooklyn accent. And I've definitely noticed that with the vowels and certain pronunciation. Yes, that's sort of one of these mysteries. You think, was there a great migration from Brooklyn or something? But a lot of the accents throughout the United States, like they say, the Cajun accent. Well, don't forget that the majority of the immigrants to the Americas were not literate, highly educated people. Like we talk about the hillbilly accent of the Appalachians. The majority of these people were very poor, low-class people from places like Scotland or Northern Ireland. Their English language was rudimentary at best. The same thing with Haitian Creole. They say it's a blending of French and African languages. That's not true, because even the French who migrated to Haiti were of the lowest class, who spoke basically a dialect from either Basque Country or Normandy, which were two of the most impoverished areas. In fact, when I was in Haiti, I hung out with a bunch of professors who were researching Haitian Creole, and they said it definitely, the influence, even vocabulary, was from the Normandy area and the Basque area, and not the French of Paris. So, you know, the languages and changes of dialect is an entire fascinating study.
And another comment, an interesting topic is why Atlanta and Houston took off economically and left New Orleans behind. Hospitality is a major source of the economy, but doesn't require a lot of education. All interesting as to why New Orleans is still lagging in its development. Could you talk about Jazz Fest? More locals love that than the touristy Mardi Gras.
Right, the Jazz Fest. Here again, that's one of these events that New Orleans has, and I don't know when the first Jazz Fest was, but it was a way of attracting people to New Orleans. And you're absolutely right, it is not an industrial city. The oil industry has a small presence in New Orleans, but most of it is further north in Baton Rouge, which is higher in elevation and it is safer. New Orleans is a harbor, and it was for the transfer of ships coming down the Mississippi, riverboats, transferring it to ocean-going vessels, which is still a major industry there, if you want to call it an industry, but it never developed factories. It's probably one of the most impoverished cities in the United States. It has a very low standard of education, very low standard of living. It does have its university and certain infrastructure, but precisely cities like Houston, Atlanta, other cities became industrialized, but that's not New Orleans, is it? At least I never saw it, but it never developed into a major urban center. In fact, its population is rapidly declining because as the sea level goes up, the city really has no future. It is, and plus, don't forget, New Orleans and all the Delta is sinking as well because it is built on a delta. And as the land dries, it compacts. So New Orleans sinks about 6 inches every year, and it gets deeper while the sea is rising.
Well, and I think to the point that you've made here, that life and death in New Orleans is, all in one. That it's a living city, a dying city, all of that. I think that was well illustrated today. So that's all the questions I have here in the chat. Let's see, we have one more over here.
Is voodoo still practiced today? I mean, like right now, currently? Not before, but right now?
Voodoo is still a living religion. In fact, Mama Lola in Brooklyn, until she died just a couple of years ago, had one of the most successful voodoo temples outside of New Orleans. Now, they do have the Voodoo Museum. They do have voodoo for tourists. That's a big money earner for the city, voodoo tourism. But voodoo has been studied. The Serpent and the Rainbow, a wonderful movie, which I'm sure is upstairs, explores Haitian voodoo, where it is still very much alive. And that is still part of it. Now, what's interesting about voodoo is I'm a member of the American Academy of Religion, which is a gathering of scholars and writers and whatnot on religion. And they do have a section that was formed just a couple years ago on voodoo, where they study it as a blending of African religions and Catholicism. So it is still practiced and it still has its followers, but I would say a good percentage of them are just in it for the money and don't take it seriously. But yes, it is still considered a serious object of religious study. Yes.
Okay, one more question.
The official colors of the Mardi Gras are green, gold, and purple. Do you know where the colors originated from? Why those particular colors are used?
That I have no idea, and I didn't know there were official colors, so that's interesting, yes.
So we have some homework for you there, Ron.
Okay, very good.
All
right.
Thank you very much. Just a reminder, Ron is going to be actually back 1 week from today for our Sandwiched In again, and this time much closer to home. We'll be in Central Park in spring. Hope to see you then. Enjoy the weekend, everybody.
Okay, thank you, everybody.